Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for the Rising Stars talk. This is the final Rising Stars talk of this semester. Before I start the introduction, let me just quickly say two things. So I see everyone who's joined is muted. That's great. Unless you have a question, please stay muted. If you do have a question, please click the raise hand button and I'm going to manage that. I'll call on you. Byron has agreed to stop a couple of times during the talk and see if there's questions. So I'll call on you and then you'll get a chance to ask your questions. Okay, so with that, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker. We're very excited to have Byron Lowens here today. He's visiting from Clemson University, where he's advised by Kelly Kane. He does some fantastic research on the intersection of human-computer interaction and privacy and security of data. And he has a very interesting kind of aspect to his research that's different from others. He doesn't just look at how people use technology, he looks at how that technology affects society as a whole, which I think is a very interesting approach. And he has been applying his research to wearable technology, to wearable computing, and seeing how the data that's produced there and how the use of wearable computing affects privacy and security. Byron has been awarded a very prestigious Computing Innovation Fellowship. He is going to University of Michigan starting, I believe, this January to start that fellowship. So that's very exciting as a postdoc. And overall, I'm very, very excited to have Byron come visit us and have an opportunity to learn more about his work, which I've been following for a few years. So let's all welcome him. If you unmute and clap, then we'll hear you. Otherwise, you can clap without unmuting. And then Byron will take it away. Thank you, Byron. Byron, you're muted.
Sorry about that. That's like the 10th time I've done that today. So let me rewind and start over. Thank you all for the virtual round of applause. And thank you, Yuri, for the wonderful introduction. And thank you all for attending my talk. I know you all had several options of how you would use your time today. So I'm honored and pleased that I'll be able to talk to you about my work. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So today I'll be presenting a portion of my dissertation work that explores privacy enhanced solutions for control over data collected by wearable technologies. This work was originally presented during a doctoral consortium during the International Conference on MobiSys and Applications and Services in Munich, Germany in 2018. All right, so here's just a short overview of some of the things that we'll discuss today, so it won't be too many surprises. First off, I'll give you an overview of the problem, and I'll talk about why this is an important problem to solve. I'll also provide the overarching goal of my research, and also give you an overview of a dual study I conducted and what those results look like. And at this point, you all should have a flurry of questions that you're ready to throw at me, so I'm hoping I'll be able to answer all of them. All right, so first off, I want to acknowledge that this work is based off of work supported by the National Science Foundation. I also want to acknowledge my advisor, Dr. Kelly Kane, Dr. Bart Kaneinenberg. In addition, I would like to acknowledge my research lab and the collaborators from Dartmouth College that I've worked with on this project. All right, so wearables. Wearable technologies are this emerging group of technologies under the umbrella of the Internet of Things that integrate computational sensing abilities that offer unique and specific features to wearers. The evolution of wearable technologies has kind of led to this paradigm shift in healthcare and fitness. So a substantial amount of change that, data that was formerly collected inside of a clinical setting can now be collected outside of a clinical setting, while at the same time providing innovative methods to provide users and patients with actionable insights regarding their quality of health, overall well-being, things like that. Wearables have also become a valuable component in other application domains and industries, um, including financial applications, security, entertainment, but more focused on my research is around personal health information with wearable technologies. So research from CCS back in 2018 forecasted that International Data Corporation updated these figures to show that we are well past what they predicted in 2018. We're about 337 million devices were sold last year, and most of this growth was not only related to devices that are typically worn on the wrist, but this emerging group of devices that are also worn on the head or worn in the ear called hearables. Now, this class of technologies or wearable technologies can measure things like breathing, heart rate, blood oxygen saturation, um, real-time blood pressure readings, all through the use of the earlobe. So as we see that wearable technologies are becoming more and more popular, and by 2022, I think we're going to exceed that number significantly. Now, while most of these technologies are increasingly available to users, managing information privacy with these technologies is becoming even more difficult as data is being exchanged, mainly because of the personal information that's being collected by wearables. So, for instance, if data is carelessly stored and stolen through a data breach by some malicious third party or sold to some unscrupulous organization that just wants to take our data and make these crazy insights from it, um, to potentially increase health insurance risk. I mean, not health insurance risk, but increase health insurance, or even cancel policies because they can make the assumption that, oh, when you were this age you didn't work out a lot, so you're going to get sick, so we're going to cancel your policy. So the risk is so real from the collection of this data that some companies are even buying data breach insurance to protect themselves, just in the case of consumer information getting into the wrong hands. So, in regards to the privacy issues in the context of wearables, emerging technologies like wearables, um, wrist-worn devices, and even the hearables that I discussed, they may or have limited primary channels that can be leveraged for primary control. Wearables have constrained interaction capabilities. Such devices have very small displays, which make it very difficult to display notices in an informative way. Also, it's not always clear of some of the risk and implications and privacy violations that users face from adopting these technologies. So to be able to understand the privacy implications of using a system or a device and to also make informed privacy decisions, users need to be aware of some of those data practices. But prior research has shown that they aren't. So for instance, back in 2010, Fitbit users were actually inadvertently broadcasting their sex lives, and this information can actually be Googled and tracked, and it was showing up in search results. Also, in 2018, reports revealed that the fitness tracker users that use this application called Strava, um, which is a social fitness service, they showed the accurate location of U.S. military sites. Now, this is an extreme privacy risk, especially this information, because it's a lot of secret information, a lot of things that happen on these bases that don't need to get out. And if for instance, if an adversary wants to know the location of these people, this company has leaked all of this information. So we see the implication there. Another example, which this couple didn't think of it as a bad thing, but I think it, could be a potential risk. A person went to Reddit seeking help regarding his wife's abnormal elevated rate on her by her wearable data, and found out she was pregnant. He just assumed that the device wasn't functioning properly, but discovered, from the comments that his wife could be pregnant based on the data, and she actually was. So these are, it sounds cool. Oh, this guy found out his wife was pregnant with Fitbit. Some people don't think this is cool. This is an extreme privacy implication. And people can get this information and be able to make inferences about those things. Um, so one thing that we recognize in a prior study that I ran, that data collected from wearables can be looked at as a skeleton in the closet, basically something that could eventually have a negative effect on you in the first future. And from this research, I've noted that each person that uses this type of technology has an activity history that justly belongs to that person. And the data being generated by that individual should not be used in a negative way to have a negative effect on that user. In addition, recently some concerns have been raised in scientific study. Further exploration of wearable privacy from a human-centered perspective is of extreme practical importance. In 2018, during a wearables focused privacy panel held at Pulse, this actually was in Massachusetts at the Atlantic Summit on Healthcare, Fitbit director said that we really need to focus more on privacy and security and be transparent with people about what is being done with their data and give them, solutions as to, what type of decisions they can make in regards to what's being done with that data. But how? How do we do this? What are some of the solutions that you can give people more control over this information or allow them to make decisions about what's being done with that information? So that's sort of, what my research is looking at. In providing flexible, expressive privacy controls for wearables, is first, what we found in the literature is first important to understand users' willingness to share data. Who are people more willing to share data with, and who are people less willing to share this data with? This work also highlighted that existing controls are ineffective, yet there's no research up to date that I know of has proposed any effective solutions towards giving people control over their information. So the overall goal of my research using a human-centered approach where we focus first on the human side and then actually figure out ways we can develop technology to meet the human need is to contribute toward the design of usable and effective privacy control mechanisms for wearables that allow people that actually own wearables and also people that will potentially own wearables control over their personal information. So as of right now, are there any questions anybody has? All right, so I'm assuming that's a no. So I'll just keep going. All right, so today in this talk, I'll discuss an initial study that I conducted as a first step towards the exploration of how to give people control over their data. In this story, or well, not in this story, but in this study, we elicited privacy preferences of adopters and potential adopters of wearable health technologies related to the sharing of extra clinical information. And that information includes sleep data, activity data, food intake data, and physiological data that can be generated by a wearable device. This study also sought to understand if a user's individual preferences vary based on the recipient that can potentially get that information, the type of information, and the valence of that information. So whether that information is positive or negative. For instance, today I completed my step goal. That would be considered as positive. Today I didn't complete my step goal. That would be considered as negative. So what are the implications from sharing, and do these preferences vary based on these contexts? So the specific research questions that I wanted to ask in this portion of the study using a scenario-based experiment was, are users sharing preferences associated with the type of data being shared, the recipient, and the valence of the data? And also, we did a gesture elicitation component or an interaction elicitation component in this study where we elicit interactions basically that people could use to express their privacy decisions using gestures. And the goal of this part of the study was to identify a set of device independent interactions that can be integrated for wearable technologies and allow people in the moment privacy control over their data. Now, one thing that we want to understand is privacy management is completely complex, and it's quite nuanced as well. So managing privacy on miniaturized devices like wearables is extremely challenging. So a holistic understanding of how an individual manages their privacy requires context-specific studies, which is the reason that I conducted and designed the study in a way that I did. As a first step, we explore how we can contextualize privacy decisions into the user's interaction flow. and how this can be useful in providing a more effective way of giving them privacy control. Um, in our experiment, we simulated realistic privacy decision tasks, and we seek to answer the following questions with this portion of the study. What interactions do people propose to communicate privacy decisions? Does the social context have an effect on the type of interactions people propose to communicate these decisions? And are there differences in the types of interactions that people propose for situations requiring privacy? So for instance, if I'm in a situation where I'm in a room or during a a call like this and my device has notified me that some type of data is being collected and I need to share this information, how can I do that in a secret way that doesn't distract anybody in the audience to let them know that I'm not being actively involved in this presentation or this conversation by interacting with my device? So those are some of the things that we wanted to explore in the gesture elicitation component of the study. So why gestures? Why use gestures? So gestures are something that have been long explored as an interactive method through the use of technology. Also, this elicitation method is a popular participatory design techniques that's used in human computer interaction that is used to get an understanding of how people prefer to provide input to some type of interactive technology. Um, this method has been applied for the development of user interfaces for a wide array of emerging technologies, of which I won't go into much detail. But some include Surface desktops, tabletops, motion gestures for mobile devices, hand gestures for augmented reality. Array of studies have been used to leverage gestures to provide inputs to some um, interactive technology. So the goal of this dual study is to kind of bridge together research on privacy and also interactions for wearables to see how we can bring those two concepts together. Um, Now, prior work has empirically investigated users' perceptions and preferences and how they behave and concern over data that's collected by wearables. And like I said previously, other work has developed gesture sets for head-mounted devices and wrist-worn devices, as these are the two most common categories of wearables. But to my knowledge, there are no works that I'm aware of that have joined these two research streams to produce usable interactions for control over wearable technologies. Thus, there are a lot of questions that still remain unanswered about interaction design mechanisms that would, enable this type of control. But this is something that I thought that was worth exploring. So there were, like I said, this study had a this experiment had two different parts. I basically collected two separate streams of data into one. So the first part of the study is the sharing preferences task, where 32 participants participated in a within subjects repeated measures scenario-based experiment. Each scenario varied by recipient type of and valence of data, and participants were able to verbally report their sharing preferences. And this is just a overview of some of the variables that we explored. The independent variable was the type of data and the recipient data, and each independent variable had 4 levels. And as you can see right here, these are some examples of some of the scenarios that were presented. And as you see, the plus and the minus indicates whether that scenario was positive or negative. And we use these to determine the dependent variables were sharing preferences, whether people would share this information or decide not to share this information. So each scenario in the experiment described a potential instance where a wearable collected some extra clinical data about the participant. And as I mentioned before, we then asked the participant to indicate their willingness to share that information with one of the 4 potential recipients of information. In the other portion of the study, as I mentioned, the interaction elicitation portion was used to elicit intuitive interactions that allowed users to imply sharing preferences. We collected interactions from 32 participants, and it was a device agnostic approach. So while we used a Apple Watch and a set of bone conduction headphones as stimuli in our experiment, we informed participants that any interaction that they did would not be recognized by the device. So come up with the most craziest, not craziest, but anything that you could think of in the moment that you would use to express this decision um, uh, pretend that the device will be able to detect it. So again, people are like, why gestures? Like, why not just go in and use a tap or something like this? So the opportunity that I see here is that the same sensors that are used on wearables to collect data, health information, can also be leveraged to sense interactions with the device. So most wearables have a gyroscope and accelerometers. These sensors not only can detect, you know, if you're moving, if you're walking, they can also detect, interaction. So we thought this was a good way to leverage sensors already on the devices to see what type of interactions people would propose. Um, so in terms of the sharing preferences task, some of the factors that influence privacy can be shown here. So we calculated the percentage of items people are likely to share based on the type of data. We also examined participants, um, which recipient group participants are more willing to share their data with, and does the valence of data influence sharing. So as we see in terms of data, activity data, which was surprising, was the type of data people were least likely to share, and physiological data was the type. I mean, well, I assume physiological data would be something that people would be less likely to share, and something like activity data would be something that people would be more likely to share. Um, for the recipient of data category, we see that people are more likely to share data with a healthcare provider. And we also see, which is pretty obvious, people are more likely to share positive data than they are with negative data. Now, one thing that I didn't explicitly explore in the study is reasons as to why participants are less willing or more willing to share certain type of data with a certain group based on the valence. But this could be related to self-presentation. For instance, as we can see that people they aren't willing to share much data with the broader social network if it's negative. So this could, relate to self-presentation. Basically, I may want to limit my sharing because I don't want it to communicate a negative or, negative image about me saying that, oh, this person is lazy, they don't work out. So while this data is enough, I didn't feel like it was enough to communicate any, you know, good results. So to assess the effect of the independent variables that I mentioned on participant sharing preferences, we used a generalized linear mixed effects model using multi-level regression with a random intercept to account for repeated measures. So each participant was given 12 individual scenarios to express privacy sharing preferences. Um, I did the regression analysis in R. So while building the regression models, we did a 4 stepwise procedure, adding the strongest independent variable to the model at each step and then comparing it against the previous model. So as this table shows the effect of the independent variables on the share and withhold decision. Now we find surprisingly that there were no significant interactions effects present at either the two-way, where type and recipient, type and valence, and type and valence and recipient, and there were no significant interaction effects at the three-way interactions. This was pretty surprising, but it could have been related to the fact that we only recruited 32 participants. I see that if we had more participants, there probably would be definitely a large effect between type and recipient, but we didn't see an interaction effect with that. Now we did see a significant main effect for the recipient group, which shows that recipient had an effect on sharing and also valence of data. Surprisingly, type of data didn't have an effect, and we can actually see that here, where while activity data was the lowest, these are relatively the same across. So that variable didn't have a significant effect on participants sharing preferences. So we did find that, like I said, the recipient group had the largest main effect on participant sharing preferences. The most commonly shared data was with a healthcare provider. People were 23 times more likely to share their data with a healthcare provider in comparison to the baseline group broader social network. people were 6 times more likely to share information with a member of their family and friends. And in terms of an employer, people weren't, I think it was like 2 times likely to share with an employer, but broader social network had the lowest sharing. And this is pretty interesting. I didn't put it in my slides. So we found out that the recipient category, broader social network, had the lowest effect. But I've read in some forums that people said that they're sharing data on communities like Fitbit with people that they've never met virtually. So there was some inconsistencies there in what people, actually do and what they say that they would do. And this kind of relates to the privacy paradox, which I'm not going to get too much into in this study. Um, but this also shows the odds of sharing basically across a recipient group. Now, when it comes to negative and positive data, the healthcare provider, people were willing to share both types of data with them almost pretty evenly. But in terms of the other recipient groups, when it comes to sharing negative data, people were less likely to share that data with that given recipient group. Now, some of the contributions that we find in this work. So, despite existing literature, examining this same, thing, examining concerns about wearables concerning the type of data, the type of device used, the types of sensors used to collect that data, even perceived risk and concerns towards the type of data. As far as I know, there's no scientific literature or industrial guidelines that provide adequate support for designers to build privacy preserving solutions for wearables. In addition, I've not found any work that use models to support the process of understanding adopters and potential adopters sharing preferences. Furthermore, there are no works that quantify preference level for these variables that I sought out to explore. So thus, there aren't any existing models in the literature, and such quantification that I used in my study can be valuable to facilitate the implementation of privacy mechanisms that give people control over their data. So in terms of the interaction elicitation study, to better understand participants' input interaction proposals that they would use to express their privacy decisions, I first developed a taxonomy that kind of organizes the characteristics of the interactions hierarchically. So what I did, I organized the interactions across 2 high-level dimensions, as you can see here, and that includes interaction mapping and physical characteristics. So physical characteristics describe the characteristics of the interactions themselves and include the part of the body that is used, while interaction mapping describes the nature and what input modality and things like that people prefer to use to express that decision. Now, as we can see here, we have within each high level dimension, we have 3 dimensions here. The nature dimension is divided into um, 3 different categories. Emblematic, physical, and abstract. So emblematic basically refers to implement interactions that can express meaning using some movement of the body. And these are widely recognized in specific cultures. For instance, in the Western culture, a thumbs up would indicate, something positive, or a head nod would indicate, an agreement, or a head shake would indicate an agreement. So that's one category of interactions that were emblematic, that basically these interactions meant something. We also had interactions that were physical. They physically interacted upon a physical surface of the body or the wearable device. And then we have abstract interactions where the mapping was, abstract. It didn't really mean anything. Some participants, did, things like they waved their hand in the air. So that doesn't specifically, that interaction is abstract. It doesn't, physically interact upon a device, and it's not understood as something, as a metaphor. And we also have interaction modalities. So we can see that some of the interactions were really small. We've referred to them as micro. Then we had mid-air interactions, which were things that were done in the air. We had composite interactions. These were interactions that consisted of two different interactions. For instance, somebody did a tap, then a swipe. Then we had sound-based interactions. These were interactions where people verbally expressed, I would like to share or I wouldn't like to share that information. And then we had body-based interactions where people use their feet or their head to express something. Then we had the input modality where we had three different inputs, which touch-based, motion-based, and multi, which use a combination of the previously listed modalities. And then in terms of physical characteristics, we had two dimensions, which consisted of complexity and locale. Basically, complexity refers to if the interaction was simple, such as a head nod, or if it was compound, it can be decomposed into simple interactions, such as a tap and a swipe. And then the location of the interaction, whether that device occurred on the device or off the device. This figure just illustrates a breakdown of the 129 unique interactions collected across all of the trials. Within the 5-dimension taxonomy, the most common characteristics for the interactions proposed by participants were simple, off-device, motion-based, mid-air interactions. In the major dimensions, interactions were mostly abstract and physical, and the interactions chosen to propose sharing with whole were more mostly abstract in nature. So from this, we also were able to come up with a consensus set of interactions. And to generate this consensus set, we use three different matrix, an agreement rate. So in most gesture elicitation studies, they calculate agreement rate to figure out which gestures occurred the most. And they use that as a main metric, but we wanted to use additional metrics, such as how often, that interaction occurred. And then also, interactions that had a symmetrical match. For instance, in one case, like head nod may have had a high agreement rate and it was done by a lot of participants, but the head shake may not have been commonly used. So a symmetrical match to head nod would be a head shake. Basically, a symmetrical match is just the opposite. So I would do yes to communicate yes, or to communicate share, and then a no to communicate don't share if that was my gesture of choice. And this is just, we used, so if based on each category, if a gesture met two or more of these categories, we use that gesture in our user defined set. So the interactions that we identify that can be used for privacy controls are presented here in this Venn diagram. And as I mentioned, this set combines findings about agreement, frequency of unique interactions, and interactions that had a symmetrical match. So to generate like this set, as I mentioned, we use interactions that met two or more of the criteria. And this resulted in the 20 interactions shown. In this Venn diagram, hopefully it shows a clear logical relationship between the three social contexts that we were interested in exploring. And the diagram also shows interactions that were exclusive to each social context. So we have some interactions, for instance, these interactions that were discrete that fell into this category were press a button, single button, and then press it twice. So there wasn't much agreement among the interactions when participants were asked to be discrete, which was surprising. But in terms of the other social context, we did find a larger agreement, but we were able to, if there wasn't much agreement for one interaction, we was able to use a symmetric match to add the opposite for that specific interaction. So some specific contributions to this interaction elicitation component, we were able to provide a qualitative and quantitative analysis of device-independent interactions for wearables. We were able to come up with a set of user-defined interactions. And then we were also able to explore how these interactions vary based on social context. And we also developed a taxonomy. And we also came up with some implications as to how these interactions can be incorporated to enable privacy control into existing and emerging wearable technologies. So some of the implications, as I mentioned, there wasn't a high agreement rate when we told participants to propose discrete interactions. And that would be possibly related to, when when you ask someone to show me something that you would do in a private way, that's something people aren't necessarily used to doing. So that's probably the reason why there was such a low agreement rate for the interactions when we told them to be discreet. Um, and we also, another implications we came up with was, hardware and software needs that, need to be implemented on emerging wearables. What type of sensors will be needed to detect these interaction in emerging wearable technologies? So as I mentioned early on, I designed the study to be device agnostic, meaning that although, they had on this wrist one device that may be able to detect a limited set of interactions, we told them to imagine that it would be able to detect anything. With that, with using this approach, this means our results can inform user interactions that can be implemented on existing wearables that already exist, as well as new wearables that haven't been invented. So, for example, you become researchers that are already designing wearables um, that can be in the form factor of earrings, not the ones that go in the ear, but actually the earrings that people wear that can be used to track heart rate, or a wearable earpiece that can, detect eating behavior, which is something that we're working on now in collaboration with Dartmouth. Also, a contact lens to monitor physical information within the eye to provide non-invasive medical diagnostic. So because we use this device agnostic approach, the results from our study can inform the development of new software and hardware that enables interactions. So before we actually develop the sensor to do something, we can, consider in the design of new wearables, like, okay, we have this sensor. How can this sensor can not only be used to detect health information, but how can this sensor be also used for users for interaction purposes? So now that, as I mentioned, now that we have this set of interactions that would allow people to express complex and nuanced privacy decisions on wearables, that have limited space interfaces, this is an important development for privacy in this umbrella of the Internet of Things. Privacy of the Internet of Things go back to the dawn of the field when it was called pervasive computing or ubiquitous computing. And a key innovator in this, Mark Weiser, noted that privacy was one of the most pressing issues yet to be solved in his vision of the future. And still to this day, privacy is a pressing issue in the emergence of any technology, because, especially if personal health information is being collected. So the simplicity of this in the moment binary control of share, not share, has important implications for many IoT devices where privacy control remains extremely difficult to implement in an effective way. So, in summary, um, this part of my dissertation provides users with more control over, shows that providing users with more control over personal information is definitely important, especially showing that people have granular sharing purposes across types of data and recipients of data. We also found that adopters and potential adopters desire controls based on these parameters. We also identified a set of interactions that can be used for privacy control, and potentially this set of interactions may be useful in the future to researchers, potentially on this call and this talk, or researchers in this landscape of wearable privacy, human computer interaction, who wish to just study privacy preferences on wearables, and we're developers wishing to build interfaces that enable privacy control on wearable technologies. So that's wraps up my talk. I appreciate you guys for listening. And now I'll take any questions that anybody has.
Ali, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, very interesting talk. Thank you. So I have a question about the participants of
Huh?
your study, and I wonder how much you knew about the concept of privacy and possible dangers that are out there if the information leaks, and if and how that would have your sample would have actually affected the observed outcomes of your study.
Yeah. Now, one thing that I didn't mention. So our sample was congruent with wearable users in the U.S. So our sample of participants were mainly between the ages of 24. I think it was between the ages of 24 and 35. So they were now in terms of understanding like issues or pressing issues with privacy, the only participants that we asked about the privacy concerns were those that owned wearables. Because we assumed that if they didn't own wearables, they probably weren't really sure about the concerns. So we did a post-interview questionnaire where we asked them their concerns, and some participants were aware of the privacy implications, and some of them even mentioned that they stopped using their wearable because of privacy issues, because of lack of control, because of not knowing what is actually being done with their data. There was a few participants that weren't really aware of the privacy controls, um, that are associated, well, not privacy control, but the privacy implications associated with it. But, after this study, they were well informed. But I think the group that I did were, they kind of matched the US population of wearable users. But I do think that it would be worth exploring a different set of populations. For instance, most of our populations were between a certain age, and data has shown that older adults now are adopting wearable technologies more as of late. And that could be, for numerous reasons. The adoption could be forced, or it could be related to, like my mom is older. I may want to be able to monitor, what she's doing. My mom's has no idea of privacy implication from wearing a device that can collect that information. So I definitely think our sample, gave us a good idea of people that were kind of aware of the implications. But I think a larger sample of, older adults or people from different marginalized populations to explore their privacy perceptions and understandings.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Looks like we have a bunch more questions. Akansha, can you go ahead and ask yours?
Sure. Great talk. Thanks. I wanted to pick your brain a little bit on something a little bit tangential, but the idea about wearables are collecting this data, and of course, we want to make sure that we're not revealing unnecessary private information. But the second part to this could be that there is this information that might not appear private, but eventually you end up doing some type of like machine learning on it or something, and you can then infer private things. And so the second type, that's even harder to figure out because like there's so many things you can do, and how do you characterize that? So what are your thoughts on that?
Um, so let me see if I understand your question correctly. So you're basically saying, how can we use machine learning techniques to sort of separate the inference? So we have inferences that can be made on private data, and then inferences that can be made on private data. Do you mean like data that would be considered sensitive?
Yeah, so actually the opposite. So what I'm trying to say is we want to protect private data, but say we do that and we don't protect non-private data, and everyone's like, oh yeah, the company can have this information, I don't care.
Yeah.
But just using that information, either using machine learning or just some other technique, some analysis, the company or the adversary can infer more other private information that the user doesn't even think that they can get.
Yeah.
So, for instance, with the pregnancy example that you shared earlier, it's sort of a, you have to do some inference. It doesn't tell you that hey, you're pregnant, but it's sort of a like it's I guess a direct path. There's a causal effect or a correlation or something.
Right. Yeah. That even, goes into the sense of, say for instance, my wearable is knowing that I work out every day at a certain time and I'm burning a ton of calories. I'll go run 5 miles every single day. But an adversary can get that information and say, now I know this person isn't at home at this time. Or, if, for instance, a stalker can see a woman, they exercise at this time. While that's positive information, and inferences can be made where I can stalk this person because I know that they're going to be exercising at this time. So that's something that, is definitely, worth, definitely exploring, like how can positive, like for instance, the production of positive information, what inferences can be made from that information that can have a negative effect on the user, such as an adversary. Um, that's an interesting, question, especially the use case of, my device knowing exactly what times I'm working out. Like, I don't want anybody to know that or,
Right.
have that information and be able to use that. Yeah, that's something really interesting. I've thought about it, but not, in too much detail. Actually, how can we, actually solve this problem? One case with with, stop, while it's collecting this personal health information, like don't tell people what time of the day I'm going to work out, or don't let that information be, viewable, or, turn off my GPS location so people won't know, where I am. And how can we do that in an informative way? And how can we, leverage machine learning to, do all of that information at the same time? So that's a really interesting question. And I, be interested to talk more, to see if we can brainstorm some ways of how we can, do that. Cause I've thought about it, but not thought about it in a sense, how can my positive data have a negative effect on me? So that's a really
Right.
good question.
Yeah, I've been thinking about these things as well. Again, they're very hard, so
Yeah.
solving them will take some time.
And that's the beauty of these types of questions, where, it gives us this exploration and trying to solve these hard problems for a social good, and making, uh, technology better for everyone. So yeah, I appreciate your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I can chime in on that question as well, I think that is a very important question. Even in one of the examples you showed, if you ask someone, do you want to share your heart rate? They might say, sure, what's the big deal? But if you ask them, do you want to share whether you're pregnant? That's a very different question. Turns out they're actually the same question to some degree, right? So hard questions.
Yeah,
Eric,
and
go
yeah,
ahead.
even with the Fitbit, inference that people were making, like for instance, with Fitbit, you share data in graphs. So you share heart rate variability in graphs. So for instance, if I'm sharing this information with my doctor, and just worst case scenario, I got off work late, or I was, as a PhD student, we don't really sleep much. We decided, oh, I've been, doing research all day. I'm gonna go for a late night run. Now my healthcare provider can look at that data and see a spike in my increase at in the wee hours of the morning. That's going to be an inference that they're going to make that I necessarily may not want them to make. They may infer, like, Fitbit was going, oh, this person, their sexual activity is going on because of spike in increase in heart rate in the middle of the night. And usually that's, typically, not the case. So that's a really interesting, problem to solve.
Yep. Erica, go ahead with your question.
Hi, thank you so much. Your talk was wonderful.
Thank you.
The question I have for you is that we just had literally on Friday a discussion with the filmmaker from Coded Bias with our college, because we're really looking at these things and it's very relevant in our world right now. And we also had our dean giving a talk on it. And so the question I have is related to Coded Bias and the algorithmic justice league, talking about bias in data and all of these different things. How much of their work informs your direction in your research? Because I see a lot of similarities in the way that you speak about the research. How are you connected to that movement? Or are you not connected to that movement and see your research outside of that?
Yeah,
I'd love to hear your answer.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you to give me a little bit more information about coded bias, because I don't think I've heard of it. I've heard of the concept of biases can be made from, from data, but I haven't. I'm not really familiar with that group. So if you can,
Sure.
fill me in a little bit more, I can tell you, how my work is related to this one.
It basically talks about algorithms and the fact that it's based on historical information, and the fact that that historical information is a lot of times biased. because it was created in a world that wasn't created for everyone to be
Right.
included in the research, correct? A
Right.
lot of this research was done on specific groups that and other groups were excluded. So you're basing all of these things that you're talking about. For example, you're talking about wearables, you're talking about this health information, you're talking about all this data that you're putting in here that believe it or not, the places like Amazon and all these places are going to pull out. And where is it the responsibility of computer scientists to be able to say when that is not okay? And looking at it, when your good research can be used for bad, right? And it goes on to talk about some of the social concerns that people have with the most evasive technologies being used on communities from lower social economic backgrounds before they are given to more wealthy environments. So that work, and if you haven't looked into that work, I would really say check it out. You might really be, your eyes might be open to a lot of cool things that can inform your research.
And I'll definitely check it out. And that's the issue. And I've, fell prey to that before I, got involved with this work around humans. In computer science, it's kind of this cart before the horse technique where our concern is to build the technology and to get it to work. And then we'll solve the other problems later. And I think, it needs to be, as technologies are becoming more, emerging and certain biases can be made, I think we need to consider the implications of the technology before we actually build it, and then design the technology around the potential biases, around the, certain things, because some of the research that I'm going to be doing in my postdoc is looking at privacy perceptions around marginalized populations. Like a lot of these populations aren't necessarily aware of privacy implications in any aspect. They're not aware, that this information can have a negative effect on them in the future. So it is our job as computer scientists to, develop, more groups and, do more outreach and informing these people about this. And also, as designers and researchers, design this technology with these users in mind and merge it into the design. I think it's a concept called privacy by design, where, they came up with this concept where they're, instead of designing it to work, they're designing it to be, to give people control and privacy first, and then building the technology. And then, all of these inferences that can be made with this data, with the algorithms, a program is determining that bias, not a real person. So that's something definitely worth interesting. I'll definitely take a look at the group, but that's something I'm, definitely interested in. How can we overcome some of these things, especially for these groups that aren't really aware of it, or this groups that are potentially at risk.
Thank you so much, Byron. And I'll make sure to send Yuri a copy of the links from the actual talk on Friday with our dean and everyone else. You'll enjoy it.
Okay. And my information is here too, if anybody wants to jot it down and reach out to me personally.
Great, thanks, Erica. Okay, so I think Ami has our final question. Go ahead, Ami.
Hey, hi, great talk. So my question is around COVID-19 and contact tracing. So right now with COVID-19 around and everyone trying to use digital tools for contact tracing, the question I had was, what are your thoughts on the privacy considerations of using wearables for contact tracing?
So I
understand it's not with respect to gestures, but I understand it's with respect to location that you'll be using it. But then just if you could share your thoughts on using wearables.
Yeah, so I haven't really thought about the contract tracing, but I did think it was weird that some wearable technologies have built in this hand washing feature where they're tracking how often that you're washing your hands. I thought that was pretty, privacy invasive. But in terms of contact tracing, that is, a serious implication, because, is this going to be something that's going to be mandatory, while we're in the middle of a pandemic? Are wearable, developers going to be putting this type of technology on wearables? Are you going to be required to use it? And, with that, I'm not even sure, if I want somebody to know, where I'm at all the time. While it does, help slow the spread or, find the path of the disease, but I'm not necessarily interested in someone knowing, where I've been or, using that information because, while it can be used for a specific purpose as contact tracing, that information can be used for another reason as well. So I haven't thought too much about it in the context of contact tracing, but, how could, what are the things like GPS location? Like you don't even need GPS location to actually track, where a person is anymore. You can use like other inferences, like I think a connection to a network or things like that to figure out where people are. So yeah, I haven't thought too much about it, but I think it's a really interesting problem that needs to really be, addressed and focused on because me personally, I don't want to be traced. I don't even wear a wearable anymore. I do research on wearables and I don't even wear one for that reason. So that's a good question, though.
Thank you.
Okay, it looks like Akanksha has our final question. She's come up with another one. Go ahead.
She's muted though.
She is muted.
Sorry. I just wanted to say I wanted to add to this conversation because what the New York State government has been doing is they came up with this app that only takes as information your connections with other mobile devices around you instead of your location itself. So that's one way of like making it less privacy invasive, is that they're not tracking your location, but they're only your device will, anytime it comes in certain proximity with another mobile device, it'll store that mobile device's ID or something. And that's what used for contact tracing. So I thought that was really cool. Like, especially like when I'm researching privacy, like those are things that matter. And I was happy that the government tried to do something about that.
Yeah, I do know I know one university, I can't think of the university, but within their mobile app, they had a contract tracing feature within the application. And whether your GPS was on or not, you could still your location or where you've been, but they may have used that similar technology where they allowed phones to, talk to each other. But still, for instance, all right, so say if there's a case where one person contracted the disease or contracted, got COVID, they still have to inform, like for instance, although it's an ID number for that phone, how is that person going to be contacted? Like for instance, if one person catches COVID, like, and that phone sees that you were around mobile ID 2, 3, 4, and 5, like how do they inform those people? There has to be some type of exposure or some type of surveillance that's being done to let them know you were around this person, so you may need to get checked. Although it's, masked as an ID, as a mobile ID, I still think it's still weird to me, that another phone can get my phone's mobile ID. Because what other information comes from that, mobile ID? Is it just a mobile ID? Does it, other things about my phone? Is, could a hacker get certain information on my phone? So I'm still a little bit leery about that, but
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so we reached the 1 o'clock mark. Let's thank Byron for his talk one more time. If you can unmute yourself and talk.